Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the second talk of the ECR panel. And today we have Mohini Mehta with us. So, Mohini is currently a PhD candidate in sociology at Uppsala University, and she was also a former visiting graduate student at the University of Toronto. She is trained as a social anthropologist with an MA from Central European University and as a development practitioner with a master's in social work from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. She brings an interdisciplinary approach to the study of food, power, identity in South Asia. Her bachelor's degree in history from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, further anchors her work in archival and contextual research. She has examined the role of immigrant food businesses in shaping their socio-political identity in the country of residence in Sweden and in Canada. Beyond academia, Mohini is also served as an editor, as a co-editor of the Graduate Journal of Food Studies and works as a bilingual storyteller and spoken word poet, performing pieces on gastropolitics, feminism, and subaltern narratives across 4 countries. She is also the co-founder of a non-profit organization called FOLK, FOLK, supporting livelihood enhancement and gender empowerment in the lower Himalayan region. Thank you so much, Mohini, for joining us and for agreeing to deliver this talk.
Thank you so much, Sanchita. I'm really grateful to Behun Collective for inviting me to share my research insights with the scholars and fellow professionals all across. And thank you very much to everybody who has joined today for the talk. Monday evenings aren't the best time usually, but I'm really glad there have been so many people who have graciously come over. So I'll be very happy to discuss my research and to hear everyone's feedback and have an insightful discussion about the same. So if that's okay, can I just share my screen and start?
Just unmute yourself, Mohini.
Yes. Okay, here we begin. Yeah. Okay, I hope my screen is visible to everybody.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. All right. Okay, so the title of my PhD dissertation is The Kitchen and the Market Space, Exploring the Gastropolitics of Delhi Through the Lens of Caste and Gender. Uh, this one is a research which is steeped in several interdisciplinary ideas, feminist framework, and anti-colonial theories. This basically addresses the sociological question of reclamation and negotiation of identity by Dalits through creative resistance and strategies which are centered around food, specifically commensality, and explored through this research is to highlight the Dalit experiences around the practices of food consumption, procurement, preparation. And at the same time, I've also looked at the political and cultural positioning, struggles, and negotiations which are experienced by the Dalits and are reflected through their culinary practices, and which lies at the intersection of caste, class, and gender. So, some of the key research questions which have guided my research are essentially around understanding how gender, culinary practices, and food consumption constitutes the everyday negotiations around Dalit identity and agency, specifically in case of Delhi. And I have chosen Delhi as a site because every city has had a very different experiences with caste reclamation, identity, and also in the way caste has been performed. within India, I have also had experience of living and working with different marginalized social groups in Mumbai. And the way caste is understood and it's practiced and manifested in Mumbai, or for that matter, Chennai, Kolkata, is very different from what happens in Delhi. And the reason why I specifically chose Delhi was to highlight how the city and its different aspirations, which are shaped by the history, by the socio-political composition of the city, as well as the immigrant nature, can completely change how different castes interact with each other. And this is what my dissertation has attempted to explore. Um, so, the second research question and the guiding principle is understanding the process of boundary formation, and that is across and within the different caste groups among Dalits. So, it's not only the boundary formation between Savarnas and Dalits, but it is also within Dalits that how the boundary formation is carried out through culinary and commensal practices. And the third one is understanding how Dalit owned or Dalit led food businesses negotiate caste, class, gender, and social capital through their business practices. This again is very important because I have tried to understand identity formation in two spheres. The one is personal, which is within people's homes, to see how gender, social division of labor, and caste realities produce certain kinds of identity and power dynamics. The other one is to understand it in the public spheres where food is transacted. So, to see how caste plays a role there and what could other factors contribute towards creating an identity is what I really wanted to understand. And that hence becomes the third guiding principle of this research. So this is how my theoretical framework looks like. I'm really sorry for a slightly pixelated picture of this. Uh, the research is rooted in the anti-colonial perspective, which I'm going to discuss a bit later. It looks into the decolonial and post-colonial feminist ideas about how do we understand knowledge creation and experiential ideas. So I have borrowed from scholars like Roy Cornell, who has spoken about mosaic epistemology, and who have vehemently challenged the very Western Eurocentric ideas of only treating Global South as a matter of subjects for the theories. Instead, Professor Cornell has said that, how theories have to rise from the Global South themselves, like from the experiential learnings. There have, of course, been a lot of criticism of Cornell's theories, which the thesis has tried to unpack and explore. In the similar framework, I have looked into the idea of perspectival realism, which has been one of the major theories propounded by sociologist Julian Go. That is to understand that how the different perspectival realities completely shape the theoretical and epistemical understanding of certain realities. And I have embedded that in context of my research, wherein the Dalit practices have to be theorized through their experiences in their own words. For that, I have also taken help of the Dalit feminist frameworks, which have been shaped by likes of Professor Sharmila Rege, Chaya Dattar, Gopal Guru, and the likes. So that is the premise. In this theoretical framework, you will see three concentric circles, intertwining circles, which looks like what I would like to refer to as the thalis. And this comes from this very strong metaphor of the idea of a cuisine in South Asia, which are usually reflected by thalis as the metaphor. The thalis also stand as a metaphor for food which is in abundance, for something which speaks of diversity, of different culinary ingenuity and expertise. And unfortunately, as many scholars have spoken about, there is no Dalit cuisine. There has been years of shame, stigma, pain, deprivation associated with the Dalit foods, rising from their history, as Shahu Patole has also marked in his books, The Dalit Kitchens of Marathwada. So there has been no Dalit thali per se. The idea was to also challenge this very Savarna notion of what a thali constitutes. And you would see these thalis intertwining, which is very ironical because thalis are supposed to be these solid objects which are non-permeable. My idea to show these intertwining thalis is to actually show the tensions and the spillages which the thalis can lead to, which which can happen when you actually have two thalis getting clung to each other. So that clinkering, that spillage is that sociological standpoint from where I need to understand stuff like commensality, Dalit agencies, food waste, social hierarchies, and cultural embodiment. And those are the points where the intersection happens. And that is where I try to understand how identities are created, how resistances are registered, and how negotiations are carried out over food. And that's what this framework tries to show. The three major pillars of this research, of course, are caste and gender, culinary practices, and the gastropolitics, which also cover a lot of these issues, which you can very well see in this framework. And the intersections is where the creative strategies and the gastropolitical negotiations come in. I will very briefly speak about my methodology. Of course, I'd be very happy if we can have a longer discussion on it during the discussion and question and answer round, because I would love to hear your ideas and would like to share more about it. But I know there's a paucity of time, so I would not go over and over again in greater details. So my research has been embedded in the qualitative paradigm. It's an ethnographic research. I have carried out 9 months of intensive data collection. And in addition to that, there have been 4 months of field reconnaissance in Delhi. I have conducted observation at 33 sites across Delhi, which include some of the major monuments, some secular festive celebrations, conferences, local vegetable markets, entrepreneurial spaces, Ambedkar Jayanti celebrations, most of the things which cover the foodscape and scenario of different neighborhoods and regions of Delhi, along with also surveying what the government calls as Valmiki Bastis within the city. I have also conducted a series of several semi-structured interviews with a total of 12 participants who are finally included in the thesis. There were a couple of other participants who were interviewed, but because of various reasons and ethical issues, they chose not to continue or were not included in the thesis. Then one important factor for me in this research has been my own positionality. As a Savarna researcher, it was very important for me to ponder a lot. And I think personally, that is what has taken me the longest time to also think a lot about my own positionality and to undergo this practice of reflexivity to understand that as a researcher, what has been my role? Is it to facilitate discussions? Is it to understand the realities? Is it, have there been times when I have been intruding or stepping over what I should not be doing? It has been a long process, and I think there has been ample discussion in my methods chapter about the same thing. And I know when I was carrying out the research, the question was very imminent that, as a non-Dalit Savarna researcher, what gives me the right to be conducting this research? And for that, I feel that, this is an interesting question to know what is the objective of one's research and what are the principles which are being followed. I've followed feminist ideas which speak about and which which just goes beyond this entire idea of being the authoritative figure. And it's something like, Anne Oakley and the likes have been challenged that, you just don't have to be somebody who's listening vulnerably and still practicing that authority that, you can you can just have a control over your participants. It's also about participating in the entire thing and making your participants the research collaborators whose ideas, whose thoughts further guide your research. The reasons I had semi-structured interviews was because the course of my research has shifted according to the narratives of the participants, of how I have understood things, and hence the theories around perspectival realism comes to picture and comes to life with this when I speak about the idea of reflexivity coming through this feminist research. So this is it. Very happy to discuss more about it in the questions. I'm really sorry. It's just probably, yeah. So the information which has been collected in forms of interviews, participant and non-participant observations have been analyzed through ethnographic analysis, wherein the interpretations have been conducted through a reflexive approach, and the meaning making has deployed symbolic interactionist approach, wherein the silences, the everyday practices, the continual observations were deployed to understand meanings of the several interactions and observations I have had. And that has been rooted in grounded theory. Of course, some of the core ideas, like, by Glaser and Strauss and Creswell, have been challenged to understand how grounded theory works, especially when one is working with the vulnerable and the marginalized social groups, because meaning making is also an act of power. And when you're making meaning, it's also important to understand whose meanings are one is talking about. And I think for that, most of my participants have also acted as the key informants, through which I have helped to understand and theorize several Dalit experiences. Hence, grounded theory becomes very pertinent here. And the entire empirical data has been embedded into the framework of power, hierarchy, gender roles, and caste identity, as was also reflected in the conceptual framework which I had shared previously. And that's how the analysis has been anchored. I will now share some of the key discussions from three of my core analytical chapters, which are mostly centered around the three research questions which I shared previously. The first one is around the gendered perspective on caste and commensality, and some of the important observations which have been here. And I mean, you can read it here, but I'll just simply discuss them with you. The first is the idea of negotiation, and it's also looking at negotiation as a creative strategy in understanding that, which are the rules which have been spoken about, which are the rules which have been challenged around caste, and which are the rules which have been internalized. So during my research, I did realize that there have been a lot of ideas from Savarna sensibilities which have been internalized by Dalit participants, particularly ideas around hygiene, whether it revolved reproductive hygiene or the commensal hygiene. That is something which was very evident through the course of the research. However, it was not just simply translated as the powerless following the footsteps of the powerful. Instead, the way participants explained it was basically around seeing that, how these strategies have also been used to create certain kind of distinctions. Distinctions between different caste members of the marginalized social groups, and also distinctions between the Savarna and the Dalits, where the Dalits for some time controlled the power of where and where not they would choose participants. She said that she's so particular about cleanliness that she chooses not to eat at certain houses where the cleanliness is not up to the mark. The entire idea that she thinks that she can choose this power to she has this power to exercise whether she wants to eat at certain places or not, does not put the entire thing into black and white that, it's a very internalized idea. Hygiene itself is very Savarna. It's also about understanding how the tools of the Savarna themselves can be used creatively to assert strength and agency by Dalits in different circumstances. It might not be absolute agency, it might not be absolute control of power, but these are these different subversions and the simple acts of subversions and resistance which works across. There is this chance of selective commensality, wherein several of my participants at different times chose whom to share food with and not. And most often than not, it was directed by caste principles, but it was also directed by the sense of social mobility, of who they would like to share their food with. And it was also a lot of the ideas about culinary creativity. So, for instance, while some participants, when they were sharing their experiences about certain festivals, there was also a very strong mention of how some women have chosen not to follow some of the strict gender rules because they feel the festivals themselves were created to help women to achieve oneness with God. And hence, while there have been certain rules, the women have chosen to flout that completely. And these show certain kind of resistance. Financial precarity has been one of the reasons why certain practices are or are not carried out. Like one of my participants, when she spoke about the fact that the family is very religious, and they avoid eating meat, over the course of conversations, the idea was also revealed that it was more of a practical decision simply because of the fact that meat is difficult to afford given the financial conditions of the family. Hence, the turn to vegetarianism is both a spiritual as well as a practical decision. So, commensal relations, there is also this sense of stigma, internalized notions of pollution. So, while the common ideas about how certain things are clean and unclean was very prominent, I did realize that there was a strong inter-religious difference among Dalits also in terms of what has to be eaten and what not. But at the same time, there was also this entire thing about detachment of stigma from certain foods. Like one of my participants, and it has been one of my favorite memories from fieldwork, is actually learning about the recipes of making kimchi, which are earthworms. And there was this entire episode of explaining how kimchi are scoured during the monsoon season in the participants' hometown, how they're prepared, how the masala is prepared, and all of that. And that sense of taking agency in detaching stigma with certain kind of food consumption also shows that the creative strategies and negotiations around food could not be just labeled into boxes of what is right according to Savarna imagination and what is not. So these resistances and subversions have been really important for me to understand how things have done. And of course, migration has shaped a lot of ideas for Dalit women, especially when it comes to accessibility. There have been so many of my participants who spoke about how they could get out of some of the very rigid issues around their in-laws being particular about caste, about gendered norms when they moved out and they started living in the city. And while they did carry some of the prejudices back with them, there were some others which they were able to negotiate due to having the agency to steer their lives in a more cosmopolitan setting. Let's just move on to the other slide. The second chapter of analysis basically deals with identity and boundary formation. And herein, I have looked more into the public aspect. And through my ethnography and participant observation, caste has been something which is both contested and reinforced at the same time. And commensality is something which is extremely important. So whether it is about certain restaurants, it is about certain spaces which cater to specific kind of people, whether it is, of course, like in Delhi, you do not have a lot of spaces which specifically speaks of that, we only cater to certain kind of people. Class and socioeconomic position is where that things happen. And it is also about what kind of food is sold where, and that is where class comes into picture. So, for example, even if one takes the example of meats, it's also about the difference in the spatial categorization of where the meat is sold. So there has been shikar ka meat or wild boar meat, which has been sold very stealthily in some of the Valmiki bastis. And it's very interesting to see how it is wrapped very stealthily in black plastic bags and it's handed over, and people are very quick to do the transaction. And at the same time, you see all these cold storage where bacon is sold, and it's put across very nicely in the cold storage kiosk, and you can rightly see and you can choose and buy. And that is where caste intersects very strongly with class, to show what kind of meat. It's not about the type of meat, it's also about the consumers of the meat and their social position, which absolutely changes the entire dynamics of who gets the authority to consume what and who is demonized for consuming certain things. So the edibility around, it's an idea which has been discussed in Professor Kiranmai Bushi's book as well, is very important to understand when it comes to consumption of meat products in Delhi, especially when seen through a casteist lens. There is also this entire idea of culinary memory, which is very strong. It is not simply seen as a as a simple catalyst of bringing through change. It's rather a very performative strategy of identity reclamation. So my participants have had varied expressions and memories of deprivation of food, and it has ranged from things like understanding that the idea of a particular cuisine is shaped by what you have eaten when you were a child, to growing up and understanding whether that thing has to be despised or it has to be reclaimed. So, for instance, one of my participants who's been married into a Savarna family shared this particular thing that for her, the festive food always meant a meat curry with rice. And there was this no concept of having several bowls wherein you would have salad and you will have curd and you will have all of these things. So the culinary memory of festivity, of celebration, of abundance was very different from the Savarna imagination. And after marriage, one of the major things through which caste was reinforced by the constant taunts of the fact that, oh, you do not really know how to eat properly or to cook properly because your idea is just so different from the Savarna imagination of what a proper meal looks like. So the resistance which comes with assertion of one's identity becomes very important with food practices. One of the entrepreneurs whom I have interviewed also recalls this idea of not having very specific kind of delicacies to share. So when they started their own enterprise, which was focused on Dalit recipes, he made sure that the recipes which were created were the ones which are actually eaten by Dalits, which are actually very dependent on certain availability of oil, spices, certain fruits, because it was not abundantly available to Dalits in his village at the time when he was reimagining the entire food. So this performative strategy is really important, and that's what culinary memory plays a great role in when it comes to thinking about what Dalit food has been and how it can be described. And so the intersection of caste and gender, as I have also discussed before, it also disrupts both patriarchal and caste hierarchies, especially in terms of women Dalit food vendors who have been around and who basically work with people outside. So there is a gendered lens to women selling food in public spaces, being in public spaces. And at the same time, there is this entire embodiment of caste as well. Who gets to buy the food, who doesn't get to, who feels secure around that area. How does a woman's identity govern a space and negotiate the claims for space was very interesting for me to understand. Then there is also the gastropolitical resistance, which also covers a lot of things ranging from social mobility, which is achieved through food, especially in terms of Dalits who follow Hinduism and who look into certain meats and certain food products with a certain kind of prejudice, vis-a-vis Dalits who are more politically inclined towards Ambedkarite ideals and Buddhism, and who understand the politics of meat. There is also this sense of being in Delhi and understanding the concept of piousness and sacredness associated with food. And there is also these subversions which have happened wherein some of the Dalit foods have been tried to be made mainstream by adapting the similar practices of Savarna. Like another food entrepreneur whom I was talking to said that I actually follow a lot of Savarna strategies to sell my food so that people don't know what my caste is, and they accept my food for what it is rather than for what, like, by whom it is prepared. So such spaces have been prepared in Delhi specifically through these food practices and commensal behaviors, which brings me to the third analytical chapter of mine, which is also the final one. And it is also about navigation of caste identity by Dalit food entrepreneurs. I spoke to a couple of Dalit food entrepreneurs, and they were divided, like they all came from three categories. So they were very small Dalit food entrepreneurs who were basically operating only in Ambedkarite or Dalit spaces or pop-ups. There have been food entrepreneurs who have been catering to largely dominant caste, middle class population across Delhi. And then there are Dalit food entrepreneurs who have invested a significant capital to make their enterprise known nationally. Excuse me. So, by looking into the different class categories, I was also able to understand the market dynamics which direct how the entrepreneurs are going to be dealing with caste in their food journey. So, it is quite interesting to see how the market access and identity has been spoken about. So, while some of the entrepreneurs have been very open about their identity, some of them have also made their own identity as the USP of their business by reclaiming the space within the Savarna marketing system and saying, hey, it is Dalit foods by Dalit people. So, some people have been like that, where there have been other entrepreneurs who have chosen not to reveal their identity. And the idea behind that is to ensure that they are not affected by the politics of caste while serving food. And this act of subversion also comes from internalization of certain Savarna ideals, which are around class and purity. So I know one of my participants, while talking about the same, said that, that I drive a fancy bike, I speak in English, I look a certain way, I don't look like my people, and my people was emphasized over there. Hence, people would not even understand my caste and they would think that, they're probably talking to somebody who's higher up in the society. So, things like this say a lot of things. It also reveals the mentality of the society towards people and shows that food is never about what is being served, it's about who's serving it. And at the same time, it also speaks about internalization of how certain ideas of purity and mobility and presence have been internalized and have been Savarna coded in the society. I'm sorry, just a minute. Yeah, I'm really sorry. However, what it also shows is that how these similar kind of internalizations and the way exploitation and discrimination has happened can also be altered by Dalit entrepreneurs to work around their own aspirations. So the fact that, there is a society which thinks of external presence or thinks about the class factor as something inherently related to Savarna, the Dalit entrepreneurs have been able to use the same for running their own businesses. The only thing is that for them, it is a matter of survival because there is always a looming fear of what will happen if the caste identity is revealed. And that surprisingly was something which most of the entrepreneurs spoke about, regardless of their class identity. The everyday acts of negotiation of identity was also closely related to the fear of facing the repercussions and consequences in case of caste identity being revealed. Another thing which I noticed was that there has been a sheer absence of Dalit women in public food entrepreneurship. There have been very few of them. I could not see them being very regular as well because they would come only at times when the male members were not coming. But it also highlights how spatial exclusion and gender vulnerability also contributes to very few Dalit women being out in the public with small food enterprises. And I have had a lot of data around the same thing in terms of shadowing some of my participants to understand how the spaces are still very masculine in terms of where food transaction happens and also in terms of what is being sold, because a lot of Dalits traditionally are also involved in selling what can be popularly in food culture called as doodh food, which is also the food which is served to people during when they are drinking or afterwards, or like, grub food and all of those stuff. Hence making the presence of women even lesser and even thinner in those spaces. So these are some of the key discussions from my 3 analytical chapters. And the research theoretically looks into how we can enhance our entire understanding of caste and gendered navigations in the city. And while we have spoken enough about that, we don't speak exactly enough about the creative resistances which are put through and how food becomes a catalyst in the entire thing. And how the experiences of every day can be theorized not simply as oppression or reclamation, but also as strategies of negotiation. And that is what I have attempted to do through this research. Um, Thank you so much. I'm really sorry. I'm not sure. Okay, I've been speaking for a really long time. I'm very sorry about that, but I'd be very happy to take any of the questions and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohini. It was a wonderful discussion and an insightful research. There's a lot of hard work that has gone into it, and this has clearly come out. I do have a couple of observations, but before I do that, I would definitely request someone from the audience if you would want to share your thoughts. I'm sure there has been some motivation for which that has got you here today to join and to hear Mohini. So, if you want to, from your experience, talk a little about your research and how it connects to the research that Mohini just mentioned about, and or the overall topic, and any other observation or question, uh, the house is open. Please feel free to talk. Okay, as and when people feel free can open up. But let me kind of start this conversation. Is a couple of observation is with respect to one is you have is about the sample size, Mohini. You said that you've done 12 semi-structured interviews. So is it only with the people who are into, you said, is either food owned or food led business? Is it only with them that you've done this 12 interviews?
Okay, so Sanchita, there are 12 participants. The number of interviews have been much larger. I have conducted a total of 36 interviews. So these have been very sustained conversations with the participants. And the participants have ranged from people. So there are three food entrepreneurs whom I've spoken to. One's technically not an entrepreneur, but somebody who works in food vending as a vegetable vendor. There have been people who are Dalit scholars, who are activists, political scientists, and at the same time, people who work as domestic workers, as daily wage laborers, as cooks in people's house. So there has been a variety in terms of the class and the qualification affiliations of these different scholars. I mean, they come from all walks of lives. And the idea has been, and like, with this small number is because I wanted to understand the thing. So there has been a lot of shadowing, several rounds of conversations which have continued to happen. The interviews have been conducted in very in-depth manner. The reason they are semi-structured is because I was also following a lot from the conversations in terms of shaping the research. So
Yeah.
that is how
So
it has been, but there has been an entire range.
yeah. So
Yes.
to my question, I mean, my question in the sense, the kind of thought that I had in mind was that you had 12 research participants, right? And you
Yes.
spoke about observation. You spoke about 32 or 33, if I'm not wrong, of observation
The
sites.
33 observation
So
sites. Yes.
33 observation sites. So what were these observation sites like? And what were your checklist? I mean, how did you choose these observation sites?
Okay, so the observation sites consisted of a lot of spaces where one would see intercaste interactions in certain ways. There were, of course, places which are unfortunately ghettoized in terms of marginalizations. So, especially like, some of the Valmiki Bastis and Harijan Bastis, as they are called, deeply problematic, of course, in their own politics, but some of them were those spaces. There were a lot of other spaces where I interviewed some of my participants, which were mixed neighborhood settings. So I started initially with the Valmiki Mastis. Then, when I started speaking and identifying more of my participants, I moved to these neighborhoods where it was a sustained research. I also visited a lot of the weekly markets which would happen at these spaces because that was a time when food and caste interaction and transactions happened. Apart from that, I was also collaborating with a couple of NGOs and CBOs who were working around different aspects of Dalit identity, some related to food and some not, and mostly related to Dalit rights. So I was also in spaces where such conferences and discussions would be held. And I followed several participants as a volunteer to certain spaces, wherein I continued later going on my own. So these were the spaces, and at the same time, while it was some of them were very quotidian in terms of looking at the everyday interaction or maybe a market transaction, the others were also motivated in terms of visiting certain monuments, certain spaces during the celebration of Ambedkar Jayanti, whether for cultural events or lectures or understanding how, excuse me, how caste interaction in these spaces happen in a politically conscious environment. So this was there. There was an entire observation guide which was prepared. And I mean, that guide has been shared in my appendix as well, wherein there was this thing about what I need to look at, what I not. There were certain times I had several conversations with the participants over there, wherein I was not a participant observation. It was like a non-participant discussion. And I explained my research to people. There were different reactions around the similar things. I have I have actually shadowed a couple of food entrepreneurs and vendors for several days, being at their stalls and just simply noticing how interactions take place. So, for instance, how even if people are paying through GPay or if they don't know about somebody's identity or not, how are they going to react to just names and surnames and what is being sold? So, all of these things have been around, and this is what I was working. And my basic idea was to understand how the process, and as I said, it is not only between Savarna and Dalits, it was also within Dalit social groups as well. So to understand most of that is how I conducted and chose the spaces to conduct ethnography in throughout the city.
Okay. So that was from the methods point of view. Thank you so much. And from the theoretical framework that you just shared with us, there is one
Mhm.
thing where which talks about, I mean, there is one inner circle that you've kind of operationalized as a thali, and that's beautiful.
Yes.
That you spoke about food ways. So how have you defined food ways? We know, I mean, from the literature, what food ways is, but how did you kind of operationalize food ways in your research?
So in my specific research and in this context, I saw foodways as specific use and deployment of narratives, culinary memories, of certain ingredients, all contributing towards creation of certain identity of what it means to be a Dalit. So, I mean, I have taken in a lot of narratives in here, which were in terms of negotiation, of talking about identities, and there have been all sorts of things. So, like from examples of mentioning about kimchi to cooking mutton curry to also trying pork or to somewhat as similar as realizing that, oh, halwa is something which is not prepared when you are not from a Hindu household during the Ashtami. All of these were examples from things. So it was all coming together, and that's how I define food ways as something which is these different ideas of recipes, narratives, all coming to see what can be constituted and understood as Dalit cuisine. Because, as we all know, and there's been a lot of great work on the fact that there is no Dalit cuisine because cuisines have a certain idea of how they are shaped, what are the historical evidences, what are the gendered labels which goes beyond that. But Dalit food is much more than that. It's different in different regions. So hence I thought of coming with the idea of food ways to define the Dalit food practices.
Yeah. So has this definition or this way of the way you conceptualized it, is it something that has emerged through your research, maybe through your, because you've also mentioned using symbolic interactionist as an approach. So is it that
Yeah.
some of these, because we tend to have a larger theoretical overarching framework, and then through our research, there are certain concepts that gets kind of basically you're able to operationalize that concept more through the research, as you're talking about Dalit cuisine, and as much as that has not been discussed so much in our in the culinary world or in the academics. So yeah, thank you so much. I understand that. And my last question to you, or last observation, would be is that you said that food is no longer about who is serving it, or it is about who is serving it, right?
It is
I
about who
mean,
is serving it, no longer about what is being served.
what is being served. But
Yeah.
I mean, if I look at it from how we see what restaurants, I mean, when we step into in the cities, basically, when we step into a restaurant or these, I mean, definitely the eating out culture has kind of evolved and has taken a different shape from what it was at the initial time. Uh, but now when we associate it with the casteist practice, in the sense that earlier who is cooking the food was more important, right? Even if we are eating out. But now, because who is cooking the food was also become something, a very political thing also inside the kitchen. Hence, it became also very kind of people became particular about who is cooking the food when we are stepping out. But in the cities, so to say, we kind of tend to believe that, okay, I mean, irrespective of who is cooking your food, it doesn't matter, right? Because
Yeah.
you're in a big city, uh, and there has been different cultures of eating. So and different kinds of institutions also that has come around in order to be able to serve the food that we want to eat, so in the public domain. So why you think is this is still very prominent, or this has come out, or how it has come out, is that people would be bothered about who is serving that food.
Yeah, thanks for both these questions. I will, before coming to this question, I will just want to say, like, adding to the last discussion about food waste, is that the idea, of course, as you said, has been developed by looking into the scholarly framework of what food waste is, especially the food studies scholars. There's been Hafez's work, there's been Jeffrey Pilcher's work, and all of those things. However, it has actually been developed taking the ideas of the participants, especially in the context, and hence the context has been very important here. Moving on to the next question, which you were asking about why people should be bothered. And I think that's a very legit question to ask, especially in very cosmopolitan settings. I mean, it's not only about, like, as all my participants also initially started the conversation, like, none of them were like, oh my God, we have so much discrimination. The first thing was, oh, we don't face any discrimination. There is no casteism. Our patrons are all very nice. It's only when you keep going into the surface that you realize that there are these subtle hints which are so caste embedded and Savarna coded that that's when one starts to realize how this becomes a big botheration. And I think I should rather rephrase what I said was, it is no longer important what is being served. I think it is, along with what is being served, it is also important of who is serving that. So something as simple as how some of my participants were like that, they are better than their counterparts or people from their own community, as they said, is because their patrons will only allow them to touch milk in the fridge and nobody else. So that would also reflect things like, how this entire idea of caste comes into picture through food. Something which looked very innocuous, but that's something I noticed so many times while shadowing the smaller food businesses where it wasn't proclaimed. So if you will see very clearly, Delhi has this way of proclaiming caste. So you would also see things like Sharma Chaat Bhandar, you would see Gupta Burgers, you'll see Agrawal Sweets, which very clearly states that, oh, there's a certain caste affiliation, which to some people it gives a sense of relief. The new system, which is around the technical, like, the UPI payments which has come in, it has also created a certain kind of caste policing in a manner. Like, I knew this one person I was standing with, they did not have any name on their kiosk. They were selling street food. And how I would know was the customers who would make the payment, it was way more than one time, is the customer would, like, announce the name of the person. Is that you I am paying to? And then would make the payment. And I have seen how this was said not only as a way of just confirming, oh, am I paying to the right person, but rather announcing it to the other people that the person might not be of the caste group they think they are. The person is not a Savarna. So this entire thing has been really important about who is serving food. And the fact has how one of my person, like, how one of my participants has explained this thing. And like he said that, the fact that I act in a certain way, I speak a certain way, I have social capital is to ensure that nobody really thinks that, it's the Dalits' hands out of which they are eating. And as terrible as it may sound, it is what the reality of society is. Because when he first opened his shop, there were some people in the locality who had great issues with somebody serving meat. Despite the fact that it's not a vegetarian neighborhood, it has a neighborhood which has all sorts of people who eat all sorts of food. But the fact that they were still ambiguous about his identity made them to rather attack this entire idea of, oh, you cannot serve meat over here. So it's only when he was himself like so coded in the Savarna practices that the people were able to accept that, okay, maybe it's fine for this guy to be serving whatever he's serving here. So the nuances, I guess, are much more deeper than only believing that, what happens and what doesn't happen. And while Delhi is very cosmopolitan now, there are several food joints, there are people enjoying all sorts of food. So there's Vietnamese to Japanese. It's also very coded in class and subsequently caste of who can access these things. And when it comes to smaller spaces, it is also about who is internalized enough to be accessing these. And I would just want to end this question with this idea about how these things are internalized for themselves. Like I remember one of the persons I met during a conference about Dalit entrepreneurs, and the person introduced himself as saying that he's not like other tribals. He's very neat and clean because he doesn't smoke and doesn't drink and doesn't eat meat. So this idea of cleanliness and neatness and purity, which comes with certain consumption, and also associating that with one's caste identity, it's not very simply just the juxtaposition or a palimpsest of Savarna identity. It is also deeply rooted in years of systemic structural discrimination, which has also become part of Savarna, Dalit identity. So I hope that answers your
Yeah,
question. I'm sorry, I veered in all possible
yeah,
directions.
yeah. But I mean, so what I was just trying to figure out is that then have you only concentrated on the small business owners, or specifically the vendors, or they are these proper in the sense they are these big restaurants. So are they the proprietors as well as the chefs who are cooking their own food in their place of business?
I
Because
have interacted with
yeah.
three of the chefs. They were not very willing to carry out the conversations. Two of them were no longer in the job. I mean, the fact was that I eventually ended up taking three entrepreneurs from three different class categories, despite interacting with a lot of them were because most of them were not very willing to be talking about the same thing, which also
Yeah,
reflects
no,
the kind of.
I was wanting to know what is the profile of the people who are in the food business. Are there the restaurateurs, the restaurant owners, the chefs, or are they just the chef?
Oh, they are the restaurateurs, the entrepreneurs who were owning the business or leading the businesses. The ones at least who have made it to the final participant list. So people who have owned the business and are also running the business. Those are the
Yeah,
ones.
because
The chefs have been
because the
spoken to and interacted, but they're not included.
right. So no, so if this whole thing of who is cooking the food we get to know that if the space is much smaller, right? Where we have direct interaction with the for instance, it's the vendor, for instance. If you see the difference between a vendor and the difference between a person owning a restaurant. Not
Mhm.
necessarily all owners would be also cooking their food, right? But
Yeah.
and not also all owners will have a direct interaction with their consumers.
Yes.
So this sense of caste identity, yeah, where is it coming? So who has this more starkly? Is it the small business owners, the vendors who have a direct interaction with the consumers, or is it more so, or both of them have this consciousness or the caste? I remember you said that irrespective of the class background, everybody were worried about their caste identity.
Yes. I would say that most like caste consciousness in terms of like, in a political sense, were of course by the people who were in the highest up hierarchies, because to be very open about having, a Dalit owned food business is like something that, you need to have certain kind of like very strong caste consciousness for the same thing. It was there. The fear or the idea of assimilation or social mobility or whatever that is called, of like, embodying certain Savarna principles was more prominent among the middle class restaurateurs, or like, the ones who were serving in like, the small scale restaurants and all, wherein the idea was basically to assimilate among the groups, to not let people know about caste identity. The very small food business owners, again, were not very particular about revealing the caste identity. There's this one specific small business whom I ever interviewed, um, who's been very caste conscious because the name of their enterprise is derived from like a very specific caste political term. So there is a strong sense, but they choose to operate only within a space which is very closely guarded by Ambedkarites and Dalits, for the obvious reason that they're very scared that this kind of political consciousness around food cannot go outside the circles, just for the fear of security. But wherever there have been public transaction of smaller kiosks, of restaurants and all, those were the spaces where the caste assimilation was more starkly demonstrated.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was all from me. There's a question in the chat box. You want to have a look at
Yeah,
it?
there are two
From
questions over
Dharmesh.
there. So I think first
Yeah.
question is by
Kritika
Dharmesh.
and
Thank you so much,
Dharmesh.
Dharmesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really important question. Something which I wanted to start with when I started with the field reconnaissance. And that is when I realized that probably I would want to write another detailed research dissertation or something on the idea of Muslim foodways in Delhi. Because there has been so many nuanced in terms of interreligious and Dalit Muslim interactions, which I also saw in my research, and I have included them somewhere. I had to cut it off because of the limited scope of my thesis. But yeah, it has been a lot, and I think I have a lot of data which I would want to work in. But I would want to say that, the fact that one community or social group is marginalized does not take away the prejudice and hatred for another community. There have been several instances talking to my Dalit participants where this entire prejudice, hatred, disgust around the foodways of the others, specifically the Muslims, came into picture. Especially when it comes to eating certain kinds of meats, and also with certain kind of eating practices. That was very, very evidently shared by a lot of participants. Most of them were participants who follow Hinduism themselves. A couple of Buddhist participants also had similar kind of experiences to share. So while it has been a very important part of my thesis, I realized that I would not be able to do justice if I would just mention them fleeting, very long text. So I haven't done that, but that is something I really want to develop in the future, in the years to come, because I think that has been very important to understand how even within marginalization, how prejudices happen and how they work, and how food becomes such a strong carrier of talking about hatred, of talking about the very jingoistic, very nationalist ideas which have been shaping around. I hope that answers your question. Okay, and next is what we have is Kritika's question. Yes, thank you so much for asking these questions. I was really hoping we can have a discussion around this thing. This was a major challenge for me when I started my research, also because on a personal level, I had so many questions of my own about the fact that, what kind of ethics does one follow? What does it mean to being a Savarna and researching a marginalized community? Is it like, are we going to repeat the very problematic anthropological rite of passage of being that, that problematic researcher who keeps like writing things and things that, they can benefit out of that? Is it going to be directed more by the principles of social work and development studies, which I have been working on? So it has taken a great deal of time in learning about that. And one realizes that it is very important to speak about your privileges and vulnerabilities with the participants when you start with the interviews, to give them that authority, because the problem is not in a Savarna conducting a research with the marginalized groups. The problem is thinking that you have the authority to be conducting that research. So the reason I have devoted several, like a considerable time to my reconnaissance was to explain to my participants what I was trying to do and what would happen because of that, with no unrealistic expectations like I'm going to change anybody's status quo. I mean, it was for a very selfish reason, which is my own research. So, transparency has been a key to explain what is being done, to understand what is happening, to share without any kind of, make up stories or ideas about what I'm trying to do. So, trust building happened that way. It was also about sharing very human bonds with people. It was not only thinking about my participants as those people who are going to just like, literally give me information. It was having those close relations. And that's what the basic principle of ethnography is. I remember how by the end of these things, one of my participants invited me over for their son's birthday party. Excuse me. And to see that, how these bonds change and what is being offered, what is not being offered, how was food shared between us, how some spaces became very feminist spaces where, of course, like, there was no abolition of the class identity and caste identity between me and my participants, but our common gendered experiences helped us unpack a lot of realities of what it means to be in the kitchen, what it means to be doing the emotional labor involved around food. So I think that all has been really important. And when I say about collaboration with community, this has always been very important to me because I know a lot of my own participants would not be able to access my research. So my idea is that apart from this thesis, what I'm working on a series of poems written in Hindi and very colloquial languages, which I'll be sharing around experiences of specific participants to the participants themselves. And these are going to be the gastroethno poems, which I generally work around. I'm also planning to make an infographic booklet talking about some of the key ideas presented in my research in very plain speak, so that the participants and their families and other people can generally have access to. And that is a plan I have been planning for the past 3.5 years. I've also constantly, simultaneously been working around it. Um, because one of the very core decolonial feminist principles is that at least the people with whom you are conducting research, they should know about your research and they should know what you have spoken about. And that has been something which has always been very important to me, because of the fact that I could not make my research bilingual as I wanted to because of the administrative requirements of my university. I did realize there could be a lot of other ways in which this research could be disseminated. I'm trying to be creative, explore more of these things. One of the ideas which I had in my master's, I don't know, I haven't had time to work through it, is to create social biography of recipes which have been shared during this research. I'm very keen on working on that. I do not have time right now by the time of my defense, but I think later on that's something I'm definitely going to do. So, yeah, that is my idea of collaborations. And of course, with some of the people who are Dalit activists and scholars, I have taken in some of their theoretical ideas and work that they have been doing. I'll be translating some of their works. And with one of the scholars, I'm trying to work around understanding their theorization and also working on it to co-conceptualize certain major theories which they want to work around in Dalit literature. So that's my idea of working with the community and working with them as collaborators. Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions?
I don't think so. There isn't any in the chat box. I think that's it. We can wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Mohini. Yeah, for this lovely talk and taking time out to discuss your research with us. And I'm sure it has been equally enthralling and a lot of learning stuff and key points for people. I think others who have joined definitely are associated with research in some way or the other. So there has been a lot of key takeaways from this discussion. And I'm happy that it went on for such a long time and there was good discussion despite being a closed group. I think that's how it should be. So thanks to you, Mohini, and all the best for your submission.
Thank you very much, Sanjita. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everybody who stayed and, for asking such important, relevant questions. I would really love to connect with each of you in different capacities to discuss more, because I feel that there is always so much to be learning from each other and to be contributing towards one's own learning. So thanks a lot for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohini, and thank you everyone for joining. We have the third talk happening tomorrow at the same time, so hope to see you all there. Thank you.